Have you ever wondered about prices? When the Big Mac was introduced, it was introduced in 1967, and there's the Big Mac right there. Was the price of the Big Mac then and the price of the Big Mac now the same? Was the price of a movie ticket now and the price of a movie ticket then in 1967 the same? If you went to see Dr. Zhivago today, would you be paying $2.25, or would you be paying quite a bit more? We're going to examine that today. And we're going to examine how economists measure the cost of living. This is chapter 11, and it is all about measuring the cost of living. You ever hear grandparents complain about today's prices? They'll say things like, things were really cheaper in the good old days. Let's look at the price of two goods and compare the prices over time. We're going to look at the average movie price in 2012, and then again, in 1967, it was 35 years. That's the reason why we picked 2012. And we're going to do the same thing with our friends, the Big Mac. How much have prices really changed? Well, for a movie ticket, the price in 2012 was what? It was $7.92. In 1967, it was $1.22 on average. In 2012, a Big Mac cost $4.33 on average, and a Big Mac in 1967, when it was introduced, which we now know, a little piece of trivia, was 45 cents. The percent increase between these 2 points is quite large. And how do we calculate that? Well, we take the price in year 2, which in this case is 2012, and we subtract the price in year 1, and we divide it by year 1, and we get this number right here, 552%. Now, if you were to calculate this out, and I'm just warning you, you're going to notice that you're a little bit off, and that's because the numbers that you're looking at there are rounded. And what, of course, economists would be using is far more precise numbers. So instead of being $1.22, it'd be $1.220437 something. So that's the reason why there's some rounding issues there. I didn't want you to panic if you started calculating it by yourself. I did the same thing. So, given that, how are we going to figure out what really is going on? Has the purchasing power changed? What is purchasing power? Well, first of all, you have to consider prices. And what we were looking at were actual physical prices, right? How much a Big Mac costs in 1967? How much a Big Mac costs in 2012? Prices are the amount of currency, in our case in dollars, needed to purchase a particular good and service. That's the price. Purchasing power refers to the amount of goods or services that can be purchased with an amount of dollars. So what are we looking at here? The difference here is your price is all about how much currency you need to purchase it. Purchasing power refers to how many goods and services you can get for an amount of dollars. So a little different schematics, but you're going to see that purchasing power is what economists stress. Could you survive today if you made the same salary that your grandfather made in 1967? Purchasing power of the dollar, and you're going to hear this a lot, what's the purchase power of the dollar, is eroded by overall price increases. And because prices tend to increase due to inflation, we've been learning about inflation, you need a much larger salary to maintain the same standard of living as you did in 1967. So you would need a 549% or 862%, depending on whether or not you're looking at Big Macs or movie tickets, to be increasing your salary to be as well off as your grandparents were in 1967. So how many Big Macs could be bought for $1 in 1967? And how many Big Macs could be bought for $1 in 2012? Well, looking at this back here, you can see that for $1, you could buy a little over 2 Big Macs. But if you look at that same dollar in 2012, look, what? You can't even buy a quarter of a Big Mac. Just wanted to go back and look. Consumer Price Index, CPI, we hear that term a lot. And it is the index that helps us measure the average changes in price paid by customers in urban areas. So just keep in mind, it is based on urban areas or urban markets for a market basket of commonly purchased goods and services. It compares the combined prices of all of these goods and services in the market basket from month to month. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, otherwise known as the BLS, collects this information about prices of goods and services in 8 major categories. You're thinking to yourself, well, what are those 8 major categories? Ha! Here is the CPI and how it gets divided up on average. The categories are foods and beverages, here 15%-ish, housing, look at that, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, education and communication, and other goods and services. So when they look at a market basket, they're looking at all of these categories. And the market basket, 15% of the market basket is food and beverage, 41% of it is your housing, 4% of it is your apparel, 17% of it is about transportation, and this would of course include what? Things like bus, planes, etc. But it would also include what? The cost of your cars. Then there's medical care, about 7% is calculated in there, recreation, and then education and communication, and then other goods and services, which is kind of a catch-all, but of course, you know, our grocer's basket isn't quite as clean as just those categories. Inflation. Remember, inflation is a rise in the general or average level of price of a good and service in an economy over a period of time. It's a trend. It's not a one-time event. In other words, we're always looking at inflation relative to what? A period of time. So we're looking at it year over year, quarter over quarter. In general, or the average, price levels rise when purchasing power decreases and our currency buys fewer goods and services. So how do we calculate the CPI? There is a method to this. So you fix the basket. The Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys consumers to determine what's in a typical consumer's shopping basket. And when we mean shopping basket in this case, we're not talking about what you and I would think of as a shopping basket, which would be only what you buy in a store. As you know, there were all those categories. Then they go out and they collect the prices of all the goods in the grocery basket, and they compute the cost of that basket. Once we know the cost of that basket, we can then move forward. So we take a base year, and the base year becomes just like the base year did when we were looking at the GDP, it becomes the benchmark. And based on that grocery basket, we look at the cost of the basket in the current year, the items we've decided to go in the basket, and the cost of that basket in the base year. By doing so, we get the CPI in any year. To compute the inflation rate, number 5, we need to see the percent change in the CPI from the preceding year. Remember, inflation rate is a trend, so it has to be compared to something. So we take the CPI in this year, and we subtract it from the CPI from last year. So we've calculated this number for this year, and we've calculated this number for last year. And then we divide it by last year. This gives us the inflation rate, and we multiply it by 100. This allows us to know what the inflation rate is comparing this year to last year. Remember I told you it was a trend? So we're going to go with our simplistic market. This particular market is very highly caffeinated and also very highly carbed. In this particular economy, we have pizza and we have lattes. And our market basket is going to be made up of pizzas and lattes. So remember back to the very first 2 points of creating a CPI, determine your market basket and determine the costs. So the market basket is only made up of pizzas and lattes. Now clearly this is a simplistic approach, but just like we talked about in chapter 2 and 3, economists use simplistic approaches to examine more complex issues because it allows us to actually see these concepts on paper. So what do? We go out and we find out the price of pizza for every single year. So we need to find out how much a pizza costs. So how are we going to know how much a pizza costs? Well, we know that in 2010, a pizza costs $10. And in 2012, that pizza costs $11. And in 2012, 12. Ah, look at the trend. Back over in the latte land, we can say in 2010, the latte was $2. In 2011, the latte was $2.50. And in 2012, the latte was $3. So if the market basket contains 4 pizzas and 10 lattes, we can then calculate the cost of the basket by taking the prices that we just determined, right there, of the 2 products, and the market basket that was determined up front. So because we know the market basket, every year we then go in and we say, okay, how much did that $4 of pizza cost us? Well, 2010, that 4 pizzas cost us $10. Okay, how much did those 10 lattes cost us? Okay, in 2010, they cost us $2. So we can figure out that our total market basket was $60. In 2011, we go out and we say, okay, how much does each pizza cost us? Well, it costs us $11. We know the market basket is 4 of them. So we now calculate that. How much did those 10 lattes cost each? They cost $2.50. So now we get what? $69. We do the same thing for 2012. Now we have the cost of the basket in each year. First thing we need to do is calculate the CPI, and then we can calculate the inflation. So if you remember, the CPI is the cost of the goods in the current year divided by the cost of the goods in the base year. So we're going to be using 2010 as our base year. So to calculate the CPI in 2010, you're going to take the cost of the basket in the current year, 2010, divided by the cost of the basket in the base year, which is 2010, multiply by 100, and you get 100. Now in 2011, you're going to take that cost of the basket, which we just calculated, which was 69, divided by the cost of the basket in the base year, which we calculated to be 60, and you're going to get, multiply by 100, you're going to get 115. Same thing for 2012. So now to calculate the CPI, you're going to take the cost of the basket in 2012, which is 78, divided by the cost of the basket in the base year, which is 2010, which is 60, and you're going to get 130. How do we calculate the inflation rate? Well, you calculate the inflation rate by taking the base year and you're going to take the current year. So for instance, if you want to know the inflation rate between 2010 and 2011, then you're going to take 2011 minus 2010 CPI divided by 2010. Current minus past over past. Multiply by 100 and you get 115. Do the same thing for 2011 to 2012. So current minus last year divided by last year times 100 gets you 13. Now, if you notice here, you thought to yourself, oh, I can just take the difference between these two numbers. And it worked great for this one, didn't it? But this one, the difference between these two numbers is not 13. It is actually, I'm sorry, it is 13. So you can take the difference between the two numbers. Let's calculate this from base. All right, that was me calculating. Now start writing these out. So we determine the market basket. In this particular case, the market basket is 10 pounds of beef and 20 pounds of chicken. So now we need to compute the CPIs in the different years. And what we're given is we're given the base year. So the base year we know to be 120. And then we're going to calculate the inflation rate. Okay, so to calculate the CPI in 2011, what are we going to do? Well, we know the market basket, right? It's determined. So now you take the market basket, it's beef. How much is beef in 2011? Well, it's $5. So $5 times the market basket's makeup, which is 10. And then how much is chicken? $5. So $5 times the market basket, which is 20, gets you 150. So if you wanted to calculate the CPI in 2011, you would take 150 divided by, oh, look, they gave you the base year. So divided by the base year, and there's your CPI. So what's the inflation rate? Ah, yes, remember this inflation rate. Does everybody remember the equation? Well, it's right up here for us. And it is the CPI of this year minus the CPI of last year divided by the CPI of last year. Okay. Oh no, they didn't give me 2012. So I've got to calculate 2012 CPI first. So what am I going to do? I'm going to find out the price of beef in 2012, which is $9. I know that I need to have 10 pounds because that's what's in the CPI basket. 10 pounds, I'm sorry. And then in 2012, the price of chicken was $6. The basket was 20 pounds. So there is my CPI. Okay, now I've got all my numbers. So I want to take, and I need to figure out the CPI. I'm sorry, that's the cost of my basket. So I need to figure out the CPI for 2012. So I know that in 2012, my CPI, the cost of my CPI basket was it was 210. And I know that my base year is what? Well, oh yeah, my base year was back to 2010, wasn't it? So 2012, 2010. Then so I take 2012's basket costs divided by 2010's basket costs, and I am going to get my CPI, which in this case is 175. So what is my inflation rate? Okay, my inflation rate is what? Okay, I need my inflation, I need my CPI in my current year. Okay, 2012. What do I have? I have 175. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. And I have my inflation rate in the last year, which is last year. Oh, I calculated on the previous slide, right? Which was 2011, which is 125. And I divide it by 125. So I get 40. So my inflation rate from 2011 to 2012 is 40%. It's a lot of inflation. So what's the problem with those numbers? Those numbers help you calculate what's going on. But one of the biggest problems is that it's based on a basket. So over time, some prices rise faster than others. And sometimes we substitute. So For instance, if a price increases and that price happens to be in the market basket that we determined, and then there's a price of another item that isn't in the market basket and it has stayed the same, we may migrate away from the market basket. And it misses substitutions, which is what I just mentioned. And overall states, it tends to overstate the cost of living. It also doesn't take into account any new goods. Because we set our market basket and that becomes the market basket, if consumers find products that are more closely meet their needs, they may move away from a product that is already in it. So it misses this effect. So it overstates the increase in cost of living. The third problem with the CPI is unmeasured quantity quality changes. So for instance, it doesn't look to see whether or not the value of the goods in the basket increase the value of each dollar, if there's some kind of improvement in the quality. It accounts for some changes, but it doesn't account for many. So in summary, each of these problems causes the CPI to be overstated. There's substitution bias, there's introduction of new goods, so people substitute and you don't know it. If there's a new good, it's not counted. And is the quality better or worse than it was before, thus making the price difference more or less relative? For instance, if the quality of a particular t-shirt changes and it's not as good a quality, but the price decreases, well, that's okay, right? If the price goes up, but the quality goes down, that's a whole nother can of worms. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, makes technical adjustments. But in general, it probably overstates inflation about 0.5% per year. Why do we care about this? Because the inflation rate is tied to things such as Social Security payments. Labor agreements are also tied to the CPI. So if you look at the two different measures that we've been examining of inflation, the GDP deflator, which we did previous chapter, and the CPI, which we did this chapter, and you look at how they trend, you start to see that they pretty much follow each other. But one of the things that's great about this is because we have two measures of inflation, by knowing when they don't follow each other or when one's lower than the other or one's higher than the other, because at some points right down here in 1970, your CPI was lower than your deflator. So by looking at that, economists can say, okay, what is happening between these two and what could be causing the inflation rates not to be identical? And because they're not identical, a further examination lets you look at the economy even closer. Now, when you get all the way over here to the 80s, look at that. We've reversed, haven't we? Look at the CPI was much higher here, and yet the deflator wasn't. So it gives you an idea of, oh, is there a new product that's entered the market, which may be why the CPI has changed? Is there a quality difference? Is there imports? Are there exports? Is there price differential? Oh, it goes on and on and on. And this allows us to start to analyze what is going on with our behavior. So contrasting, gave you two options, right? You've got a CPI and a deflator. And what you need to know is that both are great measures, but both measure slightly different things. And because of that, we need to be able to look at them. For instance, imported consumer goods. Well, they're included in the CPI because the CPI just counts a market basket, but they are not included in the GDP deflator because that is gross domestic product. If something is imported and it's a consumer good, it will not be counted. It will actually be exports minus imports. It'll be a negative, right? And we don't count it if it's not made in the United States. It's a negative. Capital goods. Capital goods, things that are purchased to produce other things. For instance, what are we talking about? Machinery, factories, etc. They're excluded from the CPI because the CPI is looking at consumer prices, but they are included in the GDP. So if the two are different, there's something you could be looking at. You could be looking at imported goods. You could be looking at capital goods to see if something is going on in the economy with those two sectors. So remember, the CPI is using a fixed basket. I showed you the things that went into it. The GDP deflator is just using whatever is being produced in that country because it's based on the gross domestic product. Whatever we produce is whatever is counted in the GDP deflator. So this matters only if the prices change by different amounts for different types of goods and services. But it does allow economists and consumers to say, wait, the GDP deflator and the CPI are different. Let's see what's going on in our economy. So let's practice this. I'm going to give you some scenarios and we're going to determine whether it affects the GDP deflator or the consumer price index. Okay, remember, consumer price index gives you a clue already, doesn't it? The three scenarios are about Starbucks, about Caterpillar, and about Armani. The first one is Starbucks. So Starbucks raises the price of Frappuccinos. Who is that affecting? Well, both. Consumer price index, if Starbucks was in the consumer price index, it would affect that. The GDP deflator, yes, because it's a product purchased in the United States. It's a gross domestic product, and we as consumers are purchasing it. So we would be buying it at a higher price. Caterpillar raises the price of industrial tractors and manufactures in its Illinois factory. Okay, so we know they're producing these products in the United States. They are domestic. But the key to this question is what? The industrial aspect of it. The GDP deflator is going to rise because it is counted as a capital good, and if somebody purchases it, it will be counted in the gross domestic product. But consumer price index does not count what? Capital goods. Armani raises the price of Italian jeans it sells in the United States. All right. Clues? Okay, one of the clues is Italian jeans. It sells in the United States. Are these produced in the United States? No. So did everybody guess this? Yep. GDP for deflator is not going to change because they weren't produced here in the United States. Gross domestic product has to be produced here, correct? And the CPI, though, does rise because we bought them. So how do you correct and deal with different inflation numbers? Inflation really is makes it hard to compare dollar amounts for different times. For instance, the minimum wage. In 1963, the minimum wage was $1.25. In December of 2013, it was $7.25. Which minimum wage had more purchasing power? The thing is, you don't know, do you? Unless you convert those numbers over to a base. So you have to either take the 1963 number and convert it to 2013, or you have to take the 2013 and compare it to 1963. In other words, compare apples to apples. So how do you do that? You take year T. In this particular case, year T is 1963. And today is December of 2013. So using this equation to figure out what something is going to cost in 2003, which is going to be today for right now, you take the amount in year T in dollars, and you take the price level today and the price level in year T. How are you going to know the price level? Ah, yes. But remember, we have the consumer price index, so we have the price levels. Now, you can definitely look these up, but I'm going to give them to you. So The Consumer Price Index in 2013 was 30.9. And I'm sorry, in year T, which would be 1963, I'm sorry. The Consumer Price Index today, I knew that number looked way too small, is 234.6. So, amount in year T. Minimum wage in 1963 was $1.25. The consumer price, the price today, okay, that is 234.6, and the consumer price index in 1963 was 30.9. So the minimum wage in 1963, which was $1.25, if you translated it to 2013 dollars, would be $9.49. Now, what does that mean? It means our minimum wage now has less purchasing power, because it was $7 and something, than it did in 1963. So researchers, business analysts, policymakers all use these to convert numbers so that they can take a look at what's happening over time. So when you start to think about it and you want to know, okay, here's our minimum wage, here's what it looks like, and it looks great on graphs. If you look at that tan graph, hey, look, the minimum wage is going up. Isn't that great? But now you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to translate this, and I'm going to make it in 2013 dollars, this number here, and I'm going to tell you right now how it would look in the past. Oh my, look at this. If we look at 2013 dollars, oh look, it had this purchasing power back here. It had this purchasing power. Oh my, look at what's happening to people's purchasing power. It's going down. And it's going down. And even now, we are at a lower rate than we were back in the 60s. So what have we done? We have said, oh, the dollar amount looks great, but when you compare it and you start to look at trends using and adjusting for inflation and consumer pricing, you can start to see the purchasing power of the consumer has actually gone down. So let's compare this for tuition. Oh, it's a subject we all love. So in 1960, a private nonprofit four-year college cost $9. That would be great. $9,340. In 2013, it was approximately, granted, $30,000. Public schools was basically about $2,000 or $1,908, and now we're talking about $88.93. A public two-year community college was $906, and now we're what? $3,264. Okay, so now you say, oh, it's all just inflation. It's the same prices. We're all paying the same. Now let's see if that's true. So I've given you the CPI for both these years, and now we're going to see whether or not tuition really has gone up or down in terms of relative prices. So there's our equation up here, available for you guys to look at. And now we need to figure out where we're going to stand. So if we want to express our tuition numbers, in other words, what in 1990 we spent on tuition in 2013, so we can compare what it is in 2013 versus what those 1990 numbers would be if adjusted, we need to calculate this. So for the private school, we're going to take the equation we had before. Remember the equation is up above here, where you take today's dollar amount is going to be equal to the dollar T, which in this case is here, the price level today, and the price level in year T. So year T prices. The price level today, the price level in year T. There we go. So a private nonprofit school that $9,340 equivalates to $16,622. Oh my. But the cost right now is $30. Wow. It's almost double. A public four-year doing exactly the same equation. So you'll notice right away that because we're comparing the same years, this portion of the equation didn't change, right? Because the price level today and the price level in year T didn't change. It was just the amount we paid. So a public school back in 1990 was $1,908. Adjusting for the price levels would come out to be $3,396. Doing the same thing again for public two-year, we can calculate the same numbers. Why do we do this calculation? Because it allows us to say what really was the percent change in price. When we start to look at this and we use those numbers we calculated, these are the numbers we calculated, and we look at the actual prices now versus the prices here adjusted, we can see that a private school education increased in price by 81%. A public school increased by 161.9%, and a public two-year increased by 102. So hey, comparatively speaking, a private school is doing pretty well. So the dollar amount is indexed for inflation, is automatically corrected for inflation by law or contract, is considered to be the indexation. So what are we saying? We're saying that there are some contracts and some agreements in which the adjustment for inflation is corrected by law or contract, and we call that indexation. So the examples of those are COLAs, which are multiple year contracts, labor contracts, and Social Security payments. Now, the one that is a bummer for all of us is the federal tax brackets. They are also adjusted for inflation and consumer price index. So by using the consumer price index, our purchasing power, we are adjusting for inflation. Now remember, that means that we're looking at numbers that have to do with consumers and their ability to price. We're using that particular inflation adjustment to adjust for labor contracts, Social Security payments, and federal tax. Now remember that we're not using the gross domestic product, we're using the consumer price index. The other thing that happens is that we use this adjustment to calculate nominal interest rates and real interest rates. Remember, the word nominal means now. So it is the interest rate not corrected, not. It's a key, not corrected for inflation. That's the nominal interest rates. So it is the rate of growth of a dollar value of a deposit or debit at that particular time, right now. The real interest rate is corrected for inflation. So it is the rate of growth in purchasing power of a deposit or debit. So the real interest rate is your nominal interest rate minus your inflation rate. So for example, if you deposit $1,000 for 1 year and the interest rate on the nominal interest rate, which is the one you would see if you walked into a bank or looked on the internet, is 9%. So during that year, the inflation rate is 3%. Well, that really means that 9% nominal minus the inflation rate, your real interest rate is 5.5. So the purchasing power of that deposit grew only 5%, not the 9% as advertised. So you grew your purchasing power by 5%, the amount of money available. So how do these trend? This gives you an idea of what's happening in an economy. And there's one of the things that is obviously trended. So here's your real interest rates. So right here, you probably would guess is probably a time of high inflation. Now over here, believe it or not, your real interest rates were higher. You probably had low inflation or negative. So to summarize, the Consumer Price Index is a measure of your cost of living. It tracks the cost of a typical grocery basket of goods and services. It's all about consumers. The CPI is used to make cost of living, COLO, adjustments and correct economic variables for the effects of inflation. The real interest rate is corrected for inflation, is computed by subtracting the inflation rate from the nominal interest rate. So the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate is the real interest rate. All right, that is the end of this chapter. You have now learned how the Consumer Price Index is calculated in the United States. I hope you found that interesting. Until next time, adios.